A hospital's patient data is leaked. A power system is hacked. A comment insulting a political leader is posted on a social media network. These scenarios might seem different, but they could all come under the banner of cybersecurity. But this meaning of this word is contested, and its lack of a firm definition means it can be easily politicized and molded to suit different agendas. Governments and businesses in particular tend to frame cybersecurity as the mitigation of risk for the state and its systems, rather than the empowerment and well-being of people. This can help justify repressive measures like internet shutdowns and restrictions on encryption. To resist this, human rights defenders need to understand the different definitions at play and be active in shaping a common definition of cybersecurity which is positive and rights-respecting. At the end of this video, you should have a better understanding of the current range of possible cybersecurity definitions, the motivations for using them, and how we can advocate for a more rights-respecting framing for cybersecurity. The term cybersecurity is disputed. Its definition can vary even from one government department to the next, and this vagueness means it can cover an almost endless range of different issues. This is illustrated by a New America Foundation study from 2014, which found over 400 different cyber-related definitions. The dominant framing of cybersecurity, developed over the years by technical, business, intelligence and military actors, focuses on the security of digital information and the network infrastructure that stores and transmits this information. For example, the International Telecommunications Union definition focuses on the protection of the cyber environment, organization, and users' assets. Similarly, many ICT businesses see cybersecurity mainly as protection against threats to information and networks, like malware, unauthorized access, and malicious code. Military organizations tend to see cybersecurity in terms of warfare. A good example is NATO's 2016 agreement that cyberspace should be considered the fifth operational domain of warfare, alongside sea, land, air, and space. Here, the focus is on ensuring the protection of networks owned and operated by NATO. Another framing of cybersecurity also focuses on information and systems, but has a broader content-related mandate. China, for example, defines cybersecurity as information security, a term whose remit goes beyond security of systems to include control over and exchange of information online. What these definitions have in common is that their conception of security is all about the mitigation of risk. The range of risks they acknowledge may be broad, but their focus on protecting systems rather than people is narrow and limiting. You might ask why we're spending so much time talking about definitions. It's just words, isn't it? But small differences in the emphasis of cybersecurity definitions can have big implications for human rights. Definitions create the norms on which policies are based and the narratives which justify them. If they're too broad or focused on systems, they can be used to justify a wide range of measures, both legitimate and illegitimate. When we add securitization into the mix, definitions become all the more important. Securitization, as we discussed in our first video, is the process by which actors make issues into security concerns. This can then enable the passage of extraordinary measures, like emergency laws, without adequate debate. Securitized narratives around cyberspace often present it as a battlefield or a den of criminals. In the absence of an internationally codified definition, this can be used to justify curbs on our fundamental rights. In the context of cybersecurity, this might mean more restrictions on content and freedom of expression, more disproportionate measures like mass surveillance, and more measures to undermine anonymity. These narratives may create the impression that security and human rights are somehow contradictory, but this isn't true. In fact, they depend on one another. Security isn't just something that is enacted on things in a narrow, negative sense of mitigating harm. Security is a positive concept, referring to a person's freedom and capacity to act. This is even recognized in human rights law. Without security, we can't fully exercise our rights. If we're browsing on a vulnerable network, our personal information is at risk, with implications for a range of rights. But it goes the other way, too. Unless we respect human rights, we can't have security either. Take South Korea's effort to ban anonymous speech on certain websites in 2007. This not only impeded free expression and privacy, but also put the data of 35 million users at risk when 2 popular websites were hacked in 2011. In this light, it's clear that cybersecurity policy shouldn't just be about risk mitigation. They should also empower people by facilitating the fuller exercise of their human rights. Without protected information and networks, people's quality of life diminishes. Policies start with definitions. Human rights defenders therefore need to be active in shaping the norms and narratives which would underpin a rights-respecting, positive definition of cybersecurity. Perhaps unsurprisingly, security actors play a big part in defining cybersecurity, from law enforcement bodies and intelligence agencies to military entities and computer emergency response teams. The forums they meet in can seem uninviting, but there is an increasing awareness of the benefit of multi-stakeholder exchange. Technical bodies, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, and the International Telecommunications Union are also active in developing their own definitions of cybersecurity. And many countries and regional organizations are now adopting cybersecurity strategies. Here, human rights defenders can usefully contribute by outlining best practices and rights-respecting models. Policy forums and conferences can help create momentum to put a rights-focused understanding of cybersecurity on the international agenda. And don't forget businesses. They handle huge amounts of our data and fund some of the main studies informing the dominant narratives around cybersecurity. Their support will be crucial if we're ever going to create consensus for a positive, rights-respecting definition. Let's look at 2 examples of real-life attempts to shape the definitions of cybersecurity and their implications. The Russian government's definition of cybersecurity, or information security as it calls it, emphasizes, among other things, the unconditional maintenance of law and order and the promotion of equal and mutually advantageous international cooperation. The first part of this clause has already facilitated surveillance measures like data localization and data retention in Russia itself. Now, alongside China, they're trying to realize the second part internationally with their proposal for an international code of conduct for information security. The proposal calls for international cooperation to curb the dissemination of information that incites terrorism, secessionism, or extremism, or that undermines other countries' political, economic, and social stability, as well as their spiritual and cultural environment. This example shows how a negatively framed definition can provide cover for actions which threaten human rights both nationally and internationally. But there are also examples of initiatives working to promote rights-respecting conceptions of cybersecurity. In 2015, the Multi-Stakeholder Working Group 1 of the Freedom Online Coalition published a new definition of cybersecurity in an attempt to challenge current dominant narratives in a balanced way. Starting from the principle that human rights apply online as well as offline, it says that cybersecurity is the preservation, through policy, technology and education, of the availability, confidentiality and integrity of information and its underlying infrastructure so as to enhance the security of persons both online and offline. Note the focus on people rather than systems and how it bridges policy, technical and human rights perspectives. This creates the basis for a shift towards a more positive framing of cybersecurity, centered on individual rights rather than threats to systems. Because cybersecurity is such a young policy area, there's still a chance for human rights defenders to shape how it's framed. To do this, they need to engage wherever it's being discussed. By coming prepared, understanding different motivations, and being able to convince stakeholders with well-evidenced arguments, it's possible to counter the dominant framings which pit human rights against security. And by championing a rights-respecting definition in the right places, human rights defenders can help ensure any measures taken in the name of cybersecurity which restrict human rights face proper scrutiny. You can't talk about cybersecurity without talking about technology. And when engaging with policymakers, it's helpful for human rights defenders to understand the basic concepts of this domain. But from a technical perspective, what does security actually mean? Popular conceptions of cybersecurity often focus on securing information and its underlying infrastructure. Information is the lifeblood of cyberspace. From personal data to high-level state communication, it flows through networks in huge quantities and is stored on devices and data centers. It is subject to voluntary standards, but without a central authority and in a rapidly changing environment, these can be subject to change. In cyberspace, information is digital and intangible, but it relies on an infrastructure which is physical, from cables to servers, routers to satellite connections. Data and metadata in cyberspace can be vulnerable at different points and be undermined in different ways. It can be copied, modified, or made inaccessible, or its origin could be faked, a violation of authenticity. Violations of confidentiality, integrity, availability, and authenticity can have different culprits. It might be criminal activity, a deliberate shutdown by a government, or even an accident. These violations can undermine security in cyberspace, but they also impact a range of human rights, including privacy, freedom of expression, and freedom of information. The Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP, illustrates this well. This refers to the set of rules which enables communications between large networks. Despite its central role in the functioning of the Internet, it remains vulnerable to misuse or attack. For example, in 2008, Pakistan's government ordered a local internet service provider to block YouTube in the country. Its attempts to do so resulted in a global outage of the video sharing website for 2 hours. The ISP did this by exploiting a weakness in the Border Gateway Protocol, so that all traffic trying to get to YouTube went to the ISP instead. As a result, YouTube became unavailable. Vulnerabilities in the BGP routes can also be manipulated to intercept internet traffic. Man-in-the-middle attacks work by redirecting large quantities of traffic to an unauthorized router. If the data is unencrypted, those controlling the router can then monitor or tamper with it before sending it on its way, without the owner of the data knowing anything has happened. This undermines the principles of integrity and confidentiality. But just as you can undermine these principles, you can also preserve and strengthen them. At the Internet Engineering Task Force, measures are under discussion to address weaknesses in BGP. If finalized, they could help make sure data goes to and originates in the right places and identify whether data is traveling on the right routes. This makes it less likely that traffic will be inadvertently intercepted or blocked, and will help make sure confidentiality, integrity and availability, and the human rights which depend on them, are respected on a technical level. Security can also be built into products and services by design. Apple and WhatsApp's adoption of default end-to-end encryption is a good example. Other tools include SSL, TLS, encryption of emails, and certificate pinning in browsers. The stakes couldn't be higher. Today, the Internet isn't just a communications network. It's a network for industrial control systems, healthcare, and in some countries even voting. As our reliance on networked systems and technology increases, the risks associated with insecure networks also increase. The Internet of Things is about to usher in a whole new universe of connected objects. This will pose huge challenges for both security and human rights. A big part of the solution is technical, as we've seen, but it's not the whole picture. Let's look again at the incident in Pakistan. After a few hours, YouTube was restored at the global level by a technical fix. But in Pakistan itself, the censorship order didn't go away, and YouTube remained blocked there until the offending content was removed. This shows that technical solutions are not enough. Security in cyberspace will only be possible with a holistic approach, which means robust technical measures and standards bolstered by rights-respecting policies and laws, responsible business practices, and education. The digital world has transformed our lives, creating new ways of communicating, organising, and accessing information. It has also created new threats, popularly known as cyber threats. In response, cyberspace is increasingly being framed as something inherently dangerous, which requires more scrutiny, management, and control. In this video, we'll explore why this framing is itself a threat to both human rights and the security of the digital environment. By the end, you'll understand the dominant ways threats in cyberspace are being framed, why this framing can be problematic, and how to get involved in these debates. In 2016, US Director of National Intelligence James Clapper delivered a talk to a naval academy. In his speech, he said, "The cyber threat is here. It's upon us now, and we need the people here today to help us defend our systems and our nation." This statement neatly captures the two dominant perspectives on threats in cyberspace. The political-military perspective, focused on threats to public safety and the security of the state, and the economic perspective, focused on threats to commercial systems and assets. Both understand cyber threats as malicious activity that seeks to undermine computer networks or systems and the information accessible through them. In media and policy spaces, these threats are discussed under many names. Data breaches, hacks, cyber incidents, and cyber attacks are just a few examples. But what do these threats actually constitute? You may recall incidents like the 2015 Sony Pictures hack, a major data breach which attracted extensive media coverage and political responses and was estimated to have cost the company millions of dollars. Or the 2007 wave of attacks on Estonian public service websites and major news outlets, which was characterized as an act of cyber war. These fit in with the systems-focused perspectives we've discussed. But some activities characterized as cyber threats stretch the boundaries of this framing. In Turkey, for example, hundreds of people have been investigated by the Cybercrime Unit for insulting the president. Here, a cyber threat can be taken to mean activities which simply involve the use of an information technology. This blurs the line between activities which affect the integrity of online systems and networks and activities which simply involve the internet as a medium. It means an art thief who uses Google Maps to escape and someone who hacks into a banking website could both be considered cybercriminals. And with cybercrime increasingly overlapping with a range of policy debates, from internet governance to child safety and counter-terrorism, defining where these boundaries sit is only going to become more important. We've established that there are ambiguities around how a cyber threat is defined. But why does this matter? Some argue that the looseness of the term feeds into securitized narratives, which present cyberspace as inherently threatening. This can then justify disproportionate measures which undermine human rights. In other words, when everything is deemed a potential cyber threat, proportionality and due process can often be forgotten. Let's be clear, there are real threats in cyberspace, and unless we're protected against them, our everyday lives will suffer. Major public services and businesses now depend on the security of networks and systems. And without proper measures in place, the huge amounts of sensitive information we share about ourselves, like our sexual orientation, political activity, or location, is vulnerable to misuse. But a securitized reading of cyber threats can create new threats for both people and systems. For example, a ban on encryption in the name of terrorism and cybercrime doesn't just damage human rights like privacy and freedom of expression, it weakens security too by creating more vulnerabilities in systems. A backdoor, after all, is a backdoor to anyone, whether that's a policeman or a criminal. So many of our rights depend on our networked information infrastructure. It's what enables us to communicate, organize, associate, create, and distribute content. If we want to retain these benefits, we need to fight for a more balanced understanding of cyberspace and the things which threaten it. Without considering rights, there can be no real security. Threats in cyberspace are discussed in a range of forums, dealing with issues related to cybersecurity, cybercrime, and cyber warfare, among others. Apart from national cybersecurity strategies, governments are developing norms of responsible state behaviour in a number of global forums, notably the UN Group of Governmental Experts in the First Committee of the UN General Assembly. Similar efforts are being discussed and developed in regional bodies like the European Union, the African Union, the Organization of American States, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Bilateral agreements, like the one signed between the US and China, attempt to define rules of procedure and mutual notification systems in case of an attack. Consultations on the Tallinn Manual 2.0 are also ongoing. This initiative, often associated with NATO, is actually an independent academia-led effort seeking to adapt international law for peace and wartime to the digital age. Most countries have established computer emergency response teams which help identify, isolate, and safeguard against viruses, hacking, or DDoS attacks. These CERTs cooperate across borders through the FIRST network, which focuses on information sharing and threat notification. In addition, there are several discussions taking place on so-called responsible disclosure. This means allowing detected vulnerabilities in systems and networks to be safely disclosed without legal persecution. This happens both at the national and regional levels. Finally, threats are often discussed at conferences and policy forums, like the Global Conference on Cyberspace, DEF CON, Black Hat, the cybercrime conferences hosted by Europol and Interpol, and PETS. The US Personnel Department was hacked in 2015, exposing the sensitive personal information of 22 million people, including mental health records and details of drug and alcohol abuse. In both human rights and security terms, this was a catastrophe, demanding urgent action to strengthen protections. This didn't happen. Instead, the incident was framed in a securitized way, with US officials looking for states to blame and weighing options for retaliation. This prevented any real debate on an appropriate response, which might have included a discussion on whether so much data should have been collected in the first place. This is an example of what can happen when policy discussions are led by a security agenda. A narrow debate makes a constructive, holistic approach less likely. Pakistan's Prevention of Electronic Crimes Bill has been under negotiation since 2015. It aims to fight crime and terrorism by restricting the ability of these actors to organise and communicate online. To do this, the bill seeks to criminalise the production, distribution and use of encryption tools. This is a good example of a disproportionate measure in response to a securitized framing of a threat. The bill makes no distinction between the tiny number of users who might use anonymity for criminal purpose and the vast majority of users who simply wish to protect their right to privacy. It also threatens free speech by criminalizing content deemed to praise those accused of a crime. The bill is not only an ineffective approach to fighting crime, it also threatens online security and data protection and undermines free expression online. Human rights defenders can engage with these issues on several levels. As individuals, we can step up efforts to strengthen our own digital security and help raise awareness of the dangers that come with digitization. We can encourage and support businesses in bringing their internal capacities up to speed and make sure they're following human rights and data protection standards. We can intervene in the spaces where threats are discussed to make sure a more proportionate, rights-respecting definition of cyber threats takes hold. And we can push governments to put in place adequate legislation and policies which put responsible limits on the power of intelligence and law enforcement agencies.